When it comes to creating our own fantastical worlds, our own stories, our own narrative structures, our own creations as artists, especially visual artists, it's really important to make sure that you find your own creative process, your own way of going about this that really matches the way you like to create things. In this episode, I want to talk about finding that creative process. It's really easy to look at how other people do these things. There are great writers with great advice. I certainly have given a lot of advice on world building and brainstorming and ideation, but ultimately, as a creative, this is all a matter of where you enter that world, the things that you come up with first, how you refine your ideas, what you do next, how you actually polish everything off. This is all a matter of you figuring out what works for you in the beginning. And what we're going to look at is how you can do that, why it's important to understand that your process will be unique, and how to avoid a lot of the traps that we fall into when it comes to kind of using other people's systems for something as personal as your own creative process. Welcome to the Visual Scholar Podcast. My name is Mcburnie. I have been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this show, we're all about demystifying the worlds of art, creativity, and productivity so that you can get better faster and enjoy your artistic journey. Check out my free brainstorming toolkit. If you want to take your art to the next level and really improve your skills, one of the best ways is to create your own personal artistic project. And to do that, you need a great idea, an idea that you're passionate about, that is unique and original to you, that is going to allow you to see this project through. I've taken the same tools and frameworks that I use every day and created a workshop on world building, ideation, and brainstorming. In it, you'll learn things like how to quiet the editing mind, how to enhance your blue sky brainstorming ability, and how to use brainstorming anchors for things like story or even your pre-existing ideas and proclivities as an artist. This is a free training. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So if that is something you're interested in, go check it out. The link will be in the description. So the reason that I wanted to make this video is to talk about one thing, which is how important it is for us to consider that our creative process, especially when it comes to something as broad and as nuanced as world building and creating our own stories and narratives, just how important finding your unique process is, and how often, because of the way school works and the way that we're often taught, we're often kind of looking for like, what is the right way to do something? And I think often with creative endeavors, so often it's about figuring out what works for us. What is actually going to work for you? How does this function for you? And I think once you get the power of this, and understand that the specific way that you actually come up with ideas, the things you start with, the things that spark your idea, how you develop that, how you take that to the next level, that this is actually part of how you come up with the idea, and it shapes and influences the flavor and the texture and all the subtle little details of the ideas and worlds that you're going to build. One of the things I really like to do is to discover the creative processes of artists that I like. And I'll often watch and take courses and read things that people have said about how things were made. Just something that's always been interesting to me. I really like the concept of process, how people make art, how people think up ideas. And you can really see, again, like everyone comes at this differently, right? Like someone who I think is well known for creating good fiction, someone like Brandon Sanderson, has a great wealth of information of like university lectures that he's recorded about how he comes up with a lot of his worlds, how he does a lot of his brainstorming. And again, I think there's always good advice to be had there. But again, the other thing you'll kind of find is depending on the type of genre that a creative individual will engage in, they're going to come up with ideas very differently, right? Directors will probably come up with their ideas very differently than someone who's trying to create this kind of nuanced fantasy world that's going to expand into many, many books. If you look at the way that sort of visual directors or visual artists will come up with ideas, we'll often come up with the visual first, right? James Cameron talks about the way that he kind of came up with the Terminator, is that he actually had a fever dream where he saw all of this fire, and emerging out of the fire was The T-800, right, was this kind of Terminator, this metal skeleton. And because it was coming out of the fire, because it was a dream, he kind of knew all in one. He had the visual and he had the concept that like this had flesh on it at one point, right? He kind of knew all this stuff. And so, that's just a very good insight into how someone who's a visual director, and again, I think it's important to make the distinction. Again, a lot of the directors who I quite like are actually artists, right? Like Ridley Scott, who we'll talk about in a minute, also another person who can draw and thinks very visually. And a lot of directors, like cinematographers and film directors, are quite visual because you're having to make pictures, right? That's how you tell the story. James Cameron also is an artist, and he's quite an accomplished artist. He can draw quite well. And he kind of drew, right, that kind of scene to a certain degree. But it just speaks to how you enter the creation process. In that case, it really is a matter of building a story and a narrative and a movie and everything around that image, right? That is such an iconic image. And the way that James Cameron will talk about coming up with ideas very much is a matter of sort of really introducing the character through an image, through this kind of hero shot. And he's kind of has a very particular way where he's building these different images and thinking about them and the sequences. Yes, there's a lot of other stuff to his craft, but that's just one example of how like some people will often just kind of start with a visual and they're really after something very particular and everything else just kind of gets built around that. And that's so important to understand because often if you look at really great world building advice, it can be from writers, and writers have great insight into the creative process because they're some of the few people who are able to write it down and articulate what they're actually doing. Whereas artists tend to be a bit more like, we kind of grunt, right? We just like the way we do it is to draw, right? It's kind of not really verbal. A writer can write. They can explain how they're doing the things that they're doing. So I think some of the best process advice that I've sort of found is actually from writers. But the problem is the way they enter the creative process is going to be very different because they're not always starting from a visual basis. Again, some of them may be, but much less so than someone like sort of Ridley Scott or James Cameron. If you look at Ridley Scott's story of creating Alien, one of the things he kind of talked about is this idea of sort of having to visualize and find the film by kind of drawing the storyboards. And he did a lot of the storyboards for the original Alien. And you can see them in the making of the Alien book. And they're quite good. They're quite accomplished. But again, he's talking about understanding the process of the way this film is going to work through drawing it. And he read a lot of comics. He read a lot of heavy metal, metal hurlant. He was into a lot of those kind of avant-garde sort of science fiction comics that really sort of changed the visual landscape in, 60s, 70s, 80s. And you can sort of see that he's entering that world in a visual way, right? He's starting with the visual. And so the key here is to understand that like often I think what we're taught is that there's this very sort of linear process to everything. And that like to truly understand something is to sort of break it down, make it sort of linear. We start at the beginning, we start at the end, we finish at the end, right? We're all kind of taught to have logic to the way we do things. And this is, I think, one of these things that just kind of comes from school. It comes from the educational system where it's all a matter of marking, of systematizing. The reality is that it's really hard to bottle a lot of the ways that actually we do come up with the idea. You often start with just one little thing and you're trying to sort of build and expand upon that and make something interesting out of it. And what that thing is often changes depending on who is creating it and what project they're working on. What is the germ of the idea? What is the seed that grows into something bigger? Finding that and developing it and understanding it and developing your process for how to do that, I think is just inherently based on the medium you're working in. It's based on your creative proclivities, what you like and don't like doing. And I just think fundamentally we need to understand that a lot of these systems and advices and things that kind of make sense and seem like, oh, if I did it that way, then I'd be logical. And that would seem like I'm sort of grown up, right? I kind of know what I'm doing because I'd be able to explain it to people. Whereas, if you kind of say, look, I had a fever dream and then I drew it and then I kind of made a movie out of it, it sounds a little bit more like we're crazy. And it's only when you succeed, right? This is the thing, is like when it comes to creative process, people really appreciate these crazy stories of like, oh, isn't it cool that James Cameron had a fever dream and sort of dreamed up Terminator? It's like, that's great when it works out. It's a great sort of film. It's not so great when you kind of dream up something with a fever dream and then you kind of get halfway through and you're like, oh, I don't really know where this is going. And maybe you don't have the drive that James Cameron did to make a film like that on a super low budget, to think it all out and sort of have the craft to make that real. But nevertheless, having a crazy creative process like that might just not be okay, but it might actually be required. It might actually be the thing that you need to do in order to make your work really sing. The second thing here is that a lot of this does actually come down to what is the focus of what you're doing. The other thing that I think you'll find is that depending on the medium that we work in with as artists, we're really going to focus differently on how we come up with ideas. And a lot of this is a matter of figuring out what is the key core aspect of what I'm doing? What is the functional reason for this idea to exist? James Cameron can come up with this fever dream image of the T-1000 to T-800 sort of walking through the flames and the flesh being sort of burnt off because he can create that image. Or at least, after he spent all the time and effort sort of designing the shot and building the VFX and stuff, he can kind of do that. But it's because film is a visual medium and he kind of knows, like, if I can make that happen, if I can like build up to that and then sell that, it's fine, right? Because that's like such a visual idea. Whereas, you're probably going to find people who work in interactive entertainment, like video games, are going to think very differently because you can't control the visual to quite the same degree. But maybe what you're trying to give people is like this persistent feeling of like interacting with a particular world, of certainly narrative structures and environments and sort of things. You could think of like, the maverick interactive designers that we have, like Kojima, who created Metal Gear and, his sort of subsequent works. And, that's probably a very different way that you would come up with an idea. It is a little bit more about a mix of everything. It's about coming up with gameplay ideas or scenarios or like a feeling you're trying to give people as they kind of trudge through a particular environment and particular things happen. So it really is often a matter of just understanding that, right? Like, is this a matter of sort of an experience artist, right? Are you really trying to build an experience of like playing a video game, of interacting with a thing, and of that having a particular feeling? Or is it just that you're visual and what you're trying to do is craft the perfect visual, right? To build a whole film to be like, when I show you this thing, boom, right? Here's like this metal skeleton walking through fire, that all of a sudden you're going to understand everything, right? It's all going to make sense and that's going to have this massive impact. It's all a matter of figuring that out. You'll also find a lot of artists who are writers, like the storytellers, the classical writers are going to have a very different process that's maybe more cerebral. They're really thinking about character interactions and what it's like to be inside a particular character. So they're maybe going to have a completely different way that they come up with ideas, and that what we actually do with our art is so important. This is why, again, you can look at how people outside your genre or your medium really do construct their stories. And I think we can gain a lot if we combine all of these ideas. But ultimately, what you're going to find, I think, is that specifically the way that you come up with things is going to be related to what you actually do with them. And that also is fine. There's no such thing as a disembodied idea. The different ideas, different concepts, the way you develop them, the way you improve them, the way you set them up and be like, okay, if I did want to have this feeling, if I did want to have this character interaction, if I did want to be inside a character in a book who was having these particular thoughts and sort of having these particular things happen to them, what would need to be true? How would I set that up? How would I build a world around that? How would I build an entire movie so that when this particular scene, which is an idea that I had, comes, people are going to feel the same way about it that I did when I was kind of dreaming it up, right? It's all a matter of sort of understanding that. And if we sort of appreciate our focus as well, I think it should be a great guiding light. Now, if you check out the brainstorming workshop that I kind of linked to and talked about in the beginning of this episode, one of the things I talk about there is the concept of anchoring. And I think this is a really key idea is, you probably will start with some functional need for this ideation, some functional need for the creations that you're making. Again, this could be gameplay. It could be that you want some philosophical story concept. Like, what would the way that a different culture thinks affect the way that my character would think when they interact with them, right? That's something that would be great for a novel, right? You're building different cultural ideas, different stories, different things. And then you're thinking about how would characters interact with that? How interesting would it be to be inside the head of a character when they're doing that? Again, very sort of basic stuff. If you're a visual story sort of fantasist, again, often what you're trying to do is come up with really kind of distinct, fantastical scenarios. And then you're trying to build and justify those and kind of make that make sense within the narrative structure. A lot of, I think, the way you can functionally do this, and again, this is a framework and hopefully you can use it in some way that's useful, is to think about anchoring to that idea. Yes, we're going to ideate, but we're going to make sure that we use the constraints of our particular medium to really focus our ideas. And I often talk about this in that workshop when it comes to anchoring via story or anchoring via drama, which is where you think about what are the ideas that you're coming up with and how do they relate to drama, or it could be gameplay, but in this case, story. What are ideas that we could come up with that would create a more interesting dramatic scenario in this environment? What are creatures that I could come up with that would be really interesting to encounter from a story perspective? And as long as you just keep anchoring, right, and you're just free associate and come up with any random idea, as long as it kind of fits a couple of points, right, what would be a really interesting way to come up with different gameplay, as long as it kind of fit with this mechanic? These are anchoring concepts to brainstorming, where we use the craft of ideation to really come up with a very specific answer to a whole bunch of random questions. So this is a fundamental tool you can use to really think about what is the functionality of my idea. Like, what am I going to do with it? You're going to make a comic, a film, a video game? Is it going to be a simple 2D video game, complex? Is it going to be realistic? Is it going to be cartoony? What are you going to do? Are you just going to be writing a book? Are you going to be writing a picture book, a children's book, right? What is it? Who's it for? What's the idea? And then we can use some of those key concepts to anchor to, right? And use them as part of our brainstorming. These are things that I think people do naturally when they just happen to be quite good at this and they develop skill. Again, what you find is a great visual director of cinema is going to anchor to what are great visuals. What are great scenes that you're going to remember? Again, there's probably not many scenes that you remember from the original Terminator movie, but there's a couple, right? And again, if you kind of can anchor to supporting and building up and enhancing those key scenes, then you kind of have a movie, right? Often movies are built around these sort of great set pieces. And great movie directors have said the same thing. Kubrick has said the same thing, that he kind of just tries to kind of create a bunch of kind of cool scenes and then kind of fit them together. And you can see that with his film. But again, that's what you remember, right? You remember these different bits. Do they go together? Maybe not that well sometimes, but it's an interesting concept. Miyazaki also has said, Hayao Miyazaki of Ghibli fame, has said that, he views the story as like sort of Edo style house building, where you just kind of build one bit and then you build another bit and then you build another bit. This is utter insanity. If you look at it from a logical perspective, if you think about structure and how it should be done, but this nevertheless works, right? Because they're optimizing for what works, for how they understand the process is going to go. And I think this is just something where if you really figure out what works for you, what you want to create, and you anchor to the best ideas that support that, you'll find that everything else is just going to support that too. And this is just a really simple idea that I think, again, it's a muscle. You need to build it, but play around with anchoring your brainstorming and ideation to whatever really works within your medium. So ultimately, the last thing we're going to talk about here is that this ultimately is you finding whatever that is for you. And this is a journey. It's hard to give any sort of framework or simple way to do this, but I guess the end result is that you just need to appreciate that if something is crazy, if it works for you, that doesn't matter. I think so often in the beginning, this was the case for me, is that, again, I read a whole bunch of these books. I read a whole bunch of different ways. They made sense to me. But when I tried them, I never felt as if they were creatively really working for me. I think ultimately that is because they were optimizing for different things than what I was really interested in. And you can often come up with something that's good, but it's not really going to highlight what's good about you as an artist, right? It's not really going to showcase you and your ideas and sort of put them on a pedestal, make everyone care about them. And if you're not really invested in the idea, it's hard to bring it to life. It's hard to bring someone else's idea or someone else's process to life all the time, especially when it's something as personal as this. So again, if I look at that sort of journey that I took as a good way to sort of explain how maybe you can sort of rethink things if you're still struggling with this, or improve things if you're like, just trying to make it sort of better. When I was trying to write my sort of fantasy comic, the Ara sort of fantasy comic, I read a whole bunch of books. I read Robert McKee's story. I read a whole bunch of books on writing comics. And the reality was, even though all those things kind of made sense to me, they really just didn't fit with what I was trying to do. And I think that it's just important to look at what would actually work for me. And what I kind of found is that my process was a bit creative. I actually started with just a picture of a character. And I was like, this kind of works for me. I actually have trouble from a creative standpoint writing the characters first, because then I kind of build this vague picture of what the character should be. And it's always hard for me to actually draw that. And because I can draw it and because I can come up with it, I guess the perfection there is tricky because I never really feel as if that's right. Whereas when I draw the character first and then I make up the story from the visual, it always tends to work better for me. There's no logic to this. It doesn't really make sense. It should feel maybe as if that shouldn't be the case, as if I really could do this, that, I should be able to do it either way. But I think when you look at how very experienced creative individuals do things, they often have weird ways of doing it. And I think if I understood that when I was making and drawing and creating the Ara project, I would have been a little bit more free to kind of pursue the crazy creative avenues that I guess sort of popped up that, I maybe sort of avoided because I was like, no, I'm trying to be structural. I'm trying to do this properly, right? I'm trying to be a professional here. And I think, again, that's an interesting dichotomy, right? Because actually some of the best professionals have really weird ways of doing things. So what I actually kind of found worked, for instance, was that I kind of wrote a bunch of stories and I wrote a bunch of different things. And I just kind of kept creating this kind of vague pattern, right? This just kind of amorphous mess of different ideas. And I kind of had a rough idea of what I had, how the plot would sort of work and who the different characters would be and what would happen. But, I really anchored a lot of it to, well, what could I create if I only set it in a forest, right? Because this allowed me to focus a lot more on just building the visual library for drawing trees. And these are exactly the type of creative constraints that you'll find directors are placed upon them. Again, if you listen to James Cameron talk about creating the first Terminator film, it was a very low budget film relative to the scope. And so he had to make a lot of creative restraint. He had to make a lot of decisions. He had to do a lot of things. And it's often that restraint that will inspire you to do interesting things. So the other thing is that when we are writing, drawing, creating, doing everything, we often feel like I should have unlimited possibility. And the reality is unlimited possibilities just doesn't ever work that well. You want restraints. You want to kind of say, let's restrict this. Let's make this more specific, right? Let's put a couple of, sort of draw some lines in the sand and make sure we got some structure here. What I found worked for me, just as a random example, is that I kind of had this vague idea for a story, but it really only made sense to me when I wrote it from basically every character's perspective. So I had the different characters and I had the story, but it really only came together for me when I literally wrote it out from the first person of every sort of major character. And then I really understood why they would be doing what they're doing. And then when I had all the character interactions, it kind of just made much more sense to me. That was just one of these weird things that I kind of found out. And I've subsequently found that that's actually a really good way to think about it. And it makes perfect sense. But when you're in the moment, again, it's hard to know, should I start with the structure? Should I start with the character? Should I start with the plot? Should I start with the setting? Like, what should I start with? How do I do this? What's important? And again, it's easy to kind of feel as if there should be some professional way to do this, some clean way to do this. But if you look at the chaos of creation for some of the best things that have been created, again, your aliens, your Terminators, it's just a complete mess. And I feel like people are often really just trying to bring random visions to life. And it's often not some linear structure, right? The creative process is inherently messy. And I think the more, again, you kind of figure out what works for you, right? This is one of these tools. What I found is like, okay, I can just have a whole bunch of ideas and they kind of don't fit together. And the way I kind of glue them together is to really view the different characters as different agents and like really figure out what they want. And I think when you have different characters that are dramatically opposed properly, then you can kind of write them and they will naturally be dramatically opposed and all the scenes will kind of work. It's only when I kind of really wrote it from the first person of all the different characters involved that I was then able to write the whole book. I knew that it would kind of end well. I had the dramatic sort of structure kind of sorted. And that kind of worked for me. So that's just a good example of how, again, I guess I started with feeling like I should be a professional. I should be doing it a particular way. I struggled with that. That was very frustrating. And I felt like these more creative ways that made more sense to me intuitively were just like silly and dumb. And that wasn't what I should be doing. What I actually found is, again, there was a lot of wisdom to doing it in different ways. And that ultimately you have to be excited about the thing that you're making. Restraints are fine. Restriction is fine. Chaos and creativity is fine, because ultimately what we're after is getting excited about a particular idea. And it can be really challenging to know why you've actually come up with a particular idea, why you keep coming up with the same stories, the same concepts, and how all this stuff kind of fits together in some weird, interesting way. We're often working with our subconscious. And anything goes. But I think if you understand that you are often working towards a bit of a system that kind of will work for you, and you can refine it and it can be crazy. As long as it works for you, then that's all that matters. So if we appreciate that our process is something that, look, probably to a certain degree already exists, you probably already have some of these core proclivities, things you like optimizing for, visual ideas, narrative ideas, like whatever it is. And it's just a matter of you discovering what really works for you. I think that's a good way to think about it. And also that I think by definition, whatever this process is that does work for you, like if you really figure out something that you could write down, right, that does seem logical, like, oh, hey, this is how I do it. That thing is going to be unique to you, right? And it should be unique to you. And you're probably not going to find it by looking outside of you. You find lots of inspiration, but you're unlikely to just kind of find a cookie cutter system for making your own worlds and your creative directorial ideas and putting them out into the world. You're really going to find like an algorithm that's going to work for that. Anyway, let's do a couple of quick takeaways before we jump out of here so that we can kind of encapsulate all of this sort of information. Firstly, if we look at a analytical takeaway here, I think that the key here is to understand that this is inherently a complex problem. As I keep saying, often when it comes to looking at professionalism, we're looking at systems and methodologies and linear progression. This is a really complicated thing because you're not dealing with something that has a definitive answer. This is not like there is a correct answer. This is a really complicated problem, but there is an infinite number of correct answers. It's not like a normal mathematical problem or something that's easy to kind of mark. So we just don't get tested on this type of creative endeavor or thought process, right? We're often like, this is just not how you do things. But the creative process is where there could literally be an infinite number of really successful outcomes that you can have. And there's equally probably an infinite number of failed outcomes that you could have, of things that just don't work, right? Things that just are completely a mess and just for whatever reason are not going to function. So it's mostly a matter of finding your sequence to kind of figure this out and understand that, again, you're not going to find also a solution in common logic, right? Or sort of traditional educational paradigms for how this sort of functions. But often when we do engage in this process, I think we do feel as if like there should be an answer here, right? Because we're used to looking for answers. But in this case, again, it's really a matter of what is your answer. If you want a really simple way to say this is just ultimately a matter of discovering what works. Look at what actually works when it comes to you doing this You're probably not going to find some theory or some idea that is really going to serve you well. This is a matter of exploring, of trying this out, of actually putting pencil to paper, seeing what happens, discovering your own process, essentially. It's much more a matter of finding it than it is a matter of picking it. If you want some practical takeaways, look, this is really simple. This is something that you actually have to experiment with. The first few times you try this, from my experience, it's probably not going to work that well. And I think the uncomfortable reality is that, like anything, you often have this idea, and the idea seems kind of sacred because in your head, like the vague idea of it is good, right? It kind of works. It's solid. But we always have this fear that if we make the idea into something real, we're going to ruin it. And the reality is you probably will. You probably will. I certainly did. Most people I know did, right? The first books, the first movies, the first things that people make, even when it's really good and they're really talented, it's never that good. You do need to experiment and play around. And often, if you look at the logic of something like the 10,000 hour rule, often when people do come up with their first feature film, or their first short film, or their first comic, and you're like, wow, that's really good. Yeah, they've probably been just doing it since they were 5 years old, right? There's often people like that where it seems as if the first few things they did were really good. It's often because, someone like Christopher Nolan, another one of these kind of directors, they were just messing around with cameras their whole life, basically. And so, when they do their first thing that really is anything, yeah, it's pretty good. But this is all built off the back of failure, experimentation, playing around. And if you build one of these things, ultimately, it can serve you for a lifetime. Having a good creative process that works with your chosen medium, works with your chosen genre, fits and draws out your unique creativity, I think is ultimately one of the greatest assets you can have. But it is a matter of building it, figuring out what doesn't work, what does work. The first few ones will probably be a bit of a dud. But this is just a muscle you need to build and develop. And the first few times you work a muscle, it's probably going to hurt. If we look at this from a philosophical or a spiritual point of view, I think that ultimately this is a matter of wrestling with one of these kind of secrets of the universe. And I know that sounds a little bit rich, right? But you really are dealing with this weird thing where, like, as a creative person, you're coming up with nonsense. You're coming up with stuff that is lies. But hopefully you're doing that so that people can see some deeper truth about the world, about themselves. And it's often only through telling these lies that we're able to discover things that are actually true. There's probably some weird kind of analysis that we could make that sort of compares this to deductive versus inductive logic. And that's probably a similar comparison where, again, you're dealing with something where there is a definitive answer in here, right? You have an idea for a world, a story, a narrative structure, for some kind of process to create your own story or an idea, whatever it is. And there is a definitive answer. There's an end point where you're probably going to be like, this is good, I've succeeded. But there's also probably a couple of those. And there's also probably a whole bunch of other ones that you maybe haven't considered, right? This is a really tricky problem to deal with because we're just so used to dealing with this kind of binary, yes, no, positive, negative, pass, fail. We're in that kind of modality by default. And I think it can be challenging for people to enter properly the true creative spirit, right? Where you are able to rationalize these massive leaps of intuition, these weird processes, and to kind of understand that to come up with all these lies that kind of make sense and tell people fundamental truth about the world, you kind of have to go a little bit nuts. And you kind of have to teeter on the edge of insanity a bit and kind of deal with these concepts. Again, fever dreams, sitting there drawing some kind of thing and kind of entering the world and imagining it. And you often have to go to those places. You have to make things a bit uncomfortable, right? Everyone has these unique creative processes. And I think often the more creative people are, the more weird some of these processes are. So I think this is just something where it's a unique challenge, right? It's not something that is going to line up with your natural kind of logical, professional kind of system. And also it is only once you get to some great point of this, where you are one of these maverick, heroic directors and you're like, hey, this is how I come up with my ideas. And everyone's like, wow, that's so profound. For every one of those, there's probably, 100,000 other people who also have weird ways of coming up with ideas. But because they never kind of make it or turn it into something. It never feels like a great story. It's just a bit of a weird way that someone fails to make something. So your goal is to find the truth here that works for you, and also to make something really good out of it. Okay, that's all we've got time for on this particular episode. This was a little bit of a philosophical one, but I think it's just good to talk through some of these issues. This is, for instance, probably an episode that most people would just think is kind of nuts and kind of talking about a whole bunch of abstract issues. But if you've ever tried to come up with your own ideas, your own fantasy worlds, you know what I'm talking about here. You know the struggles that are involved, the challenges involved, and this is just an immensely sort of complicated, tricky topic to navigate. So hopefully this has helped you at least think through it a little bit. That was my goal here. I don't think we can ever find a good answer, but certainly there's a lot of ways to kind of figure out how to build that muscle, good ways to enter it. And I think as long as you're trying and experimenting and moving forward and figuring out what works and what doesn't, eventually you're going to discover the thing that really works for you. So anyway, let me know what you think of this in the comments down below. And other than that, I'll see you on the next one.